When my marriage ended, my husband kept everything. Not everything in the dramatic sense of a man who fights for every asset and leaves his wife with nothing through legal maneuvering and aggression. Everything in the quieter and in some ways more revealing sense of a man who had organized our shared life in a way that made most of what we had accumulated technically his, because the accounts were in his name and the property was in his name and the investments were in his name, and I had allowed this arrangement to exist for 6 years because I had trusted him and because trust, when it is genuine, does not spend much time auditing the structures built around it. The divorce was handled through lawyers and it was civil in the way that divorces are civil when both parties have decided that the fastest resolution is preferable to the most just one, and the fastest resolution in our case produced an outcome that gave my husband the apartment, the car, the investment accounts, and the savings we had built together across 6 years of 2 incomes, and gave me a settlement that covered my legal fees and approximately 8 months of living expenses if I was careful. I did not fight it. Not because I did not understand what I was giving up, but because I had looked at the structure of what we had built and understood that fighting it would cost more than the outcome would return, and because I had already decided, by the time the lawyers were finalizing the terms, that there was one thing in the divorce I actually wanted, and it was not on any of the asset lists either lawyer had prepared. I asked for Harold. Harold was my father-in-law. He was 74 years old, recently widowed, in the early stages of a cognitive decline that his doctors had identified 18 months earlier and that had progressed slowly but consistently since the diagnosis. He lived alone in a house 40 minutes from the apartment my husband and I had shared, and he required a level of daily support that my husband had been providing inconsistently and with the particular resentment of a man who found caregiving inconvenient and had never developed the patience it requires. My husband did not want Harold. He had not wanted Harold before the divorce and he did not want Harold after it, and the relief on his face when I said I would take responsibility for Harold's care was the most genuine emotion I saw from him across the entire divorce process. He offered me $8,000. Not as payment exactly, or at least not framed that way. Framed as help with the transition costs, with setting up a suitable living situation for Harold, with covering the initial expenses of care. I accepted it. I signed the agreement that transferred legal guardianship and care responsibility to me. I put the $8,000 in an account I designated specifically for Harold's needs. And then I took Harold home. My name is Natasha. I am 31 years old. I work as a certified care coordinator, which means I understand the needs of elderly people and the systems designed to support them and the particular gap between what those systems provide and what people actually need, which is usually less about medicine and logistics and more about being seen and known and valued by someone who is paying genuine attention. I had been paying genuine attention to Harold for 6 years of marriage. Not because he was my father-in-law and attention was expected, but because Harold was genuinely worth paying attention to. A man who had spent 40 years building a small but solid construction business, who had raised my husband largely alone after his wife's first illness, who had a dry, precise humor and a way of listening to people that made them feel their words had landed somewhere real. My husband had inherited Harold's capacity for receiving attention without developing his capacity for giving it. I had noticed this about both of them for 6 years. It had mattered more about one of them than the other. The first year. Harold moved into my new apartment 3 days after the divorce was finalized. I had found a 2-bedroom place specifically because I knew I was going to ask for him, had been thinking about it for the 2 months the divorce was being processed, had chosen the apartment with his mobility needs in mind, the ground floor unit, the wide doorways, the bathroom that could be modified without significant expense. He arrived with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box containing his late wife's photographs and a set of woodworking tools he had not used in 4 years but was not willing to leave behind. I showed him his room, which I had arranged simply and with enough space for him to move comfortably, and I showed him where I had put a small table for the photographs, and he stood in the doorway of that room for a moment without saying anything. Then he said it was a good room. I told him I was glad. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table and I asked him what he liked for breakfast and what time he preferred to eat and whether he had any foods he could not tolerate, the practical questions that established the shape of a shared life, and he answered them with the slight surprise of a man who had not been asked his preferences about daily life in some time. The cognitive decline was real and I did not pretend otherwise to myself or to him. There were days when he was entirely himself, sharp and dry and present, and days when the edges of things were less clear to him and he needed more guidance and more patience and more of the particular steadiness that caregiving requires when it is done well. I gave him what each day required without making the variable days feel like failures or the clear days feel like exceptions. I took him to his medical appointments and sat with the doctors and asked the questions that needed asking and wrote down the answers in a notebook I kept specifically for that purpose. I found him a woodworking class at a community center 3 blocks from our apartment, adapted for older adults with varying mobility, and he attended every Thursday morning for 14 months until his mobility made it impractical, at which point I found an instructor who was willing to come to the apartment twice a month and work with him at the table in the spare room. He made me a small shelf. It took him 3 sessions and considerable patience with himself on the days when his hands did not cooperate with his intentions, and when it was finished he presented it to me at dinner with the particular combination of pride and embarrassment that people produce when they have made something for someone and are not certain it is good enough. I put it on the wall in the kitchen where I could see it from the table. My husband called twice in the first year. Once to ask how Harold was doing, in the brief way of someone performing a check rather than genuinely asking, and once to mention that he was seeing someone new and that he hoped things were going well. I said Harold was well and that I was glad he was happy, and both conversations were under 4 minutes. Harold asked me once, in month 8, why I had asked for him in the divorce. I had thought about how to answer that question because I had known it would come eventually and I had wanted to be honest when it did rather than giving him the comfortable version that would have been easier to say and less true. I told him because he was worth asking for. I told him that 6 years of knowing him had taught me more about what a person could be than 6 years of being married to his son, and that when the marriage ended the thing I was least willing to lose was him. He looked at the shelf on the kitchen wall for a moment. Then he said that was the nicest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. We had tea. We watched the program he liked on Thursday evenings. I went to bed at my usual time. In month 14 Harold asked his lawyer to come to the apartment. I did not know why at the time. I made tea for the lawyer and then I went to work in my room while they talked, because whatever Harold needed to discuss with his lawyer was Harold's business and I had no interest in being present for conversations I had not been invited to. The lawyer was there for 2 hours. Harold did not tell me what they discussed. He came out of his room when the lawyer left and said dinner smelled good and asked what I was making, and I told him, and we ate dinner and watched the Thursday program, and that was the evening. I did not find out what the lawyer had been there for until 14 months later. Harold's decline accelerated in the 2nd year. Not dramatically, not in the sudden way that certain illnesses announce their final stage with a single clear event. Gradually, the way the 1st year had been gradual, but at a different pace, the way a river moves faster as it approaches something, the current increasing without announcing why. There were more difficult days than clear ones by month 18. By month 20 the clear days were the exceptions rather than the baseline, brief windows in the morning sometimes, or an hour in the late afternoon when something would settle and he would be entirely himself again for a period that neither of us tried to extend or hold on to because we had both learned that holding on to those moments only made their ending harder. I adjusted the care accordingly. I reduced my working hours and took on remote cases where I could, because my professional background gave me the flexibility to restructure my work around his needs in ways that most caregivers do not have available to them. I hired a part-time aide for the hours I could not cover, a woman named Rosa who had been working with elderly patients for 20 years and who Harold liked immediately in the particular way he liked people who were direct with him and did not perform cheerfulness at him when he was having a difficult day. Rosa and I developed a rhythm together across those months that I am genuinely grateful for. She understood Harold the way good caregivers understand their patients, not as a condition to be managed but as a person to be known, and the 3 of us inhabited the apartment during those months with the particular ease of people who have found their respective places in a shared arrangement and are not competing for anything. Harold had good days in the 2nd year. I want to be clear about that because I do not want this to sound only like decline, because it was not only decline. On a Wednesday in month 19 he told me a story about his wife that I had not heard before, about the day they had met, and he told it with a clarity and a warmth that made the room feel different while he was talking, the way rooms feel when someone is genuinely present in them. On a Saturday in month 21 he asked Rosa to help him to the kitchen table and he sat there for 2 hours looking at the shelf he had made me and I sat across from him and we did not talk much but the sitting together had a quality I recognized as contentment, the specific contentment of a person who is where they want to be with someone they trust. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in the 23rd month. Quietly, in his room, in the early hours before Rosa arrived, in the way that people sometimes go when they have decided the timing themselves and have chosen a moment when the house is still and nobody needs to witness it and be shaped by the witnessing. I sat with him for a while before I called anyone. Not because I did not know what needed to be done but because the doing could wait for a few minutes and the sitting could not be recovered once it was over. Then I made the calls that needed making. The will. Harold's lawyer contacted me 4 days after the funeral. His name was Richard and he had been Harold's lawyer for 22 years and he had the particular manner of a man who has delivered many wills to many people and has developed an instinct for which deliveries will be straightforward and which will not. He came to the apartment, the same apartment where he had sat with Harold for 2 hours 14 months earlier while I worked in my room, and he sat at the kitchen table where Harold and I had eaten dinner for 23 months and he opened a folder and he told me what was in it. Harold had left me everything. The house, which he had owned outright for 18 years and which had been appraised the previous year at a value that made me sit very still when Richard said the number. The savings account, which Harold had built carefully across 40 years of running his construction business and which was considerably larger than I had known because Harold had not discussed his finances with me and I had not asked. A small investment portfolio that his late wife had managed and that had continued growing quietly in the years since her death. The contents of the house, including the woodworking tools he had brought in the cardboard box on the day he moved in, which were now back in the house where they had always lived. Richard also told me that Harold had written a letter, separate from the legal documents, addressed to me, which he handed across the table in a plain envelope with my name on it in Harold's handwriting from a period when his handwriting had still been steady. I did not open the letter while Richard was there. I thanked him. I walked him to the door. I came back to the kitchen table and I sat for a while before I opened it. The letter was 2 pages. I am not going to tell you everything it said because some of it belongs only to me. What I will tell you is that he said he had known, from the first dinner I had made him in the apartment, that the divorce had cost me more than anyone had calculated, and that he had decided, on the evening of that first dinner, that he was going to do what was in his power to correct the calculation. He said he hoped the shelf was still on the wall. It was. It is. The husband. My ex-husband found out about the will through his own lawyer, who had apparently been monitoring Harold's estate as a matter of routine, which told me that my husband had not been entirely indifferent to his father's assets even during the years he had been entirely indifferent to his father. He called me the day after Richard's visit. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. On the 3rd call I picked up because I had said what I needed to say to Harold's memory and to the letter on my kitchen table and I was ready to say what needed saying to the person on the other end of the phone. He said he thought there might have been a misunderstanding with the will. He said his father had not been fully competent in the final period of his life and that a will made under those circumstances might not reflect his genuine intentions. He said he had spoken to a lawyer who believed there were grounds to contest. I let him finish completely. Then I told him 3 things. I told him that Harold's lawyer had confirmed the will had been prepared 14 months before his death, during a period when his cognitive status had been assessed and documented by 2 independent physicians as sufficient for legal decision-making, and that Richard had been meticulous about this specifically because Harold had anticipated that the will might be questioned. I told him that Harold had been assessed, documented, and entirely clear about his intentions on the day he signed the documents, and that the documentation of that clarity was thorough in the way that Harold had been thorough about everything he had built across 74 years of careful living. I told him that the letter Harold had left me, which I was not going to share with him or his lawyer, made Harold's intentions and his reasoning clear in his own words, and that I was confident any court that read it would find it consistent with the legal documents rather than contradictory to them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his father had always liked me more than was reasonable. I told him I thought his father had liked me exactly as much as was reasonable, and that reasonable was a word that meant different things depending on whether you were the person who had driven him to his appointments and sat at his kitchen table for 23 months or the person who had paid $8,000 to transfer that responsibility to someone else. He did not say anything after that. I told him I wished him well. I meant it in the general way that you mean things about people you have finished your history with, not warmly exactly but not without humanity either. I ended the call. I went to the kitchen and I made tea and I sat at the table where Harold and I had eaten dinner for 23 months and I looked at the shelf on the wall and I thought about a man who had spent 40 years building things carefully and who had, in the last 2 years of his life, built one more thing that nobody had seen coming except him. He had chosen well. He had always chosen well. The house is mine now. I am moving in at the end of the month. I am bringing the shelf. It belongs on the wall of the house where it was made. If someone in your life was written off by the people who should have valued them most, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe for the next one. This is Hidden Truth Revenge, where the truth always finds a way.